the first event of the new semester, and we changed rooms, which can always cause a little hiccup on technology, but thank you, Jennifer and Shin, for navigating everything so well. It's really exciting to welcome you here to talk about an important topic. Our seminar, Why Does Japanese Fertility Remain So Low? Lessons from a Misguided Policy Approach, is looking at one of the most critical issues for Japanese society today. For the past few decades, Japanese fertility has been in decline, which has contributed to a shrinking workforce and a rapidly aging society. Indeed, some projections suggest that by the end of the century, Japan's population will be less than 1/2 of its current size. Of course, it's a little difficult to imagine everything else that will have changed 70 years from now. And I think that such forecasts need to be taken with great skepticism. But nonetheless, we do know that there is a crisis for Japanese population ahead, and it has captured the attention of the leadership. Former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe advanced a womenomics agenda, which was intended to promote female labor market participation and the emergence of more women leaders in business and government. It has met with mixed reviews. The current Prime Minister, Kishida, has also urged that more attention must be given to this critical issue, saying that it is now or never to reverse the demographic crisis. Recently, he was quoted stating, "Japan is on the verge of whether we can continue to function as a society." But there are many good reasons why young people are reluctant to take on the burden of family life, ranging from economic concerns to society, lack of support for families, and work-life balance. Well, for all of these complex issues, we are very fortunate to have one of the leading experts in the world who can help to tell us more about this topic. It's my great pleasure to introduce to you today our speaker, Mary Brinton, who is the director of the Edwin Reischauer Institute of Japanese Studies, the Reischauer Institute Professor of Sociology, and serves on the Faculty Advisory Committee of the Program on U.S.-Japan Relations. Thank you so much for your help to the program and the Reischauer Institute. Mary's research and teaching focuses on gender inequality, labor markets, employment, social demography, and contemporary Japan. She is the author of many books and articles, from Women and Economic Miracle in 1993, Lost in Transition, Youth Work and Instability in Post-Industrial Japan in 2011, many leading articles, including in 2019, American Journal of Sociology article by the title, Babies, Work, or Both? Highly Educated Women's Employment and Fertility in East Asia. As this work indicates, much of her work is on Japan, but she often places Japan in comparative perspective with industrial democracies and within the East Asia region. It is remarkable that she can publish in leading sociology journals, write extremely impactful books, and most recently published in Japanese language. We're very excited that she's going to be presenting today some of the work from her most recent book, Shibarareru Nihonjin, Jinkou Gensho o Motorasu Kihan no Uchiyabureru Ka, which in English is translated as Japan tied up in knots. Can the norms leading to population decline be broken? Published by Chuo Koron Shinsha in 2022. For all of her extensive service and research on Japan studies, in 2022, Mary Brinton was conferred the Order of Rising Sun, gold raised with neck ribbon, which is a very prestigious award given by the government of Japan to a select number of outstanding individuals. We are so delighted to have you with us today. Before I pass over to Mary, I would like to ask you to also consider our event next week, which is going to be featuring Prosperity and Human Security, Japan and East Asia's 21st Century, with several leading scholars, Joseph Wong, Catherine Ibarata Arens, Yanju Huang, Yves Terbergen, Nicholas Fraser, Joanna Lewis, all discussing over 2 separate panel events, an exciting workshop on critical issues for human security in East Asia. I hope you can join us next week. Today's today's panel is co-sponsored by the Edwin Reischauer Institute of Japanese Studies and the Department of Sociology. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Well, thank you for that wonderful introduction. And just for the record, I didn't write the book in Japanese. I have a treasured translator who translated a prior book, and I did read every word of the translation. And as wonderful as he is, this is a translator, Ikemura Chiaki, who does a lot of translations, especially of Harvard Business School professors and so forth. There were a few errors, actually, so I'm really glad I combed through the translation. This is the book. I'll pass it around just for fun. But I have been, warned that this needs to be a very short presentation. As Christina said, just half an hour. The whole seminar is only an hour. It used to be an hour and a half, but it changed format. And typically we give talks that are 45 or 50 minutes long. So I've tried to shorten very much the presentation, and I hope there'll be a lot of questions and I can get to materials that I don't have time to talk about, because obviously I can't summarize the book in half an hour. Just as a footnote, I published the book in Japanese. I haven't published anything in English. And the reason I did this also with the prior book on the so-called lost generation. And the reason was that I felt this time and that time that I was really working on issues that were very pertinent and relevant in Japanese society. And I wanted to speak first, ideally, to a Japanese audience, and make it easy for people to read what I was writing. So now it's a very funny process, and I don't know anybody else who's been crazy enough to do this, but now I'm revising the book in English, of course, and I want to make it a book that could possibly be widely read in the US, but that's a very tall order. And I need to make it much more US centric to do that. So anyway, it's a laborious process and not one I would recommend to anyone. But it's been very, very rewarding to publish in Japanese. Very rewarding to see, the reactions. Anyway, now I'm not seeing the slides up there. Am I doing something?
If you could screen share.
Oh, I need to screen share. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. It's as if you were at home, except you're here with us.
Okay. Good. Thank you.
Thank you.
Just. There we go. Okay. So Christina Davis has told you the title. And let me get rid of some of the annoying features that show up. So as Christina said, Japan faces twin dilemmas in the early 21st century. Of course, there are lots more dilemmas for every government. But the demographic challenge is that Japan is very rapidly aging. And in fact, right now, it's the most rapidly aging country in the world, although Korea will catch up. Paul Chang, my colleague in sociology, who walked in a few minutes ago, told me the current birth rate in Korea, which is now below 0.8 child per woman, far, far, far lower than Japan's birth rate. But I'll tell you why Japan's situation is so very severe in any case. So Japan has the lowest ratio of working age adults to adults over 65 years old. That's already covered. And as Christina said, we don't even need to go to 70 years from now. We can go 20 or 30 years from now, and the situation is going to be very precarious because the population is aging so rapidly. And obviously, some of the consequences of a rapidly aging population are that the pension system starts running low on money, just as our social security system would start running out of funds if our birth rate went way down and we had fewer working age adults. It's eventually going to happen in the United States, but it's much more slowly happening. Healthcare system already faces huge burdens. The need for skilled healthcare workers, is very high in Japan. And then economically, most economists argue that an aging population is bad for the economy for any number of reasons. They predict slower economic growth if you have a less youthful working population and a lower working age population. Low productivity, but Japan already has very low productivity compared to most OECD countries. Japan also has a very high national debt, so that could get worse, especially with Kishina's recent proposals. But in any case, it's bad for the national debt. And then labor shortages, which of course we've already been seeing in Japan. And obviously the main culprit is Japan's very low birth rate. And as Christina said, Kishida, opening the diet session exactly 1 week ago, spoke about this. And in fact, I have the quote that you, so you eliminated one slide in my talk, which is great. I can whiz through that. But one of the things about what Kishida said is, this is not a new problem. This is a really old problem for Japan. Oh, here we go. Okay, this is what Christina said. Our nation is on the cusp of whether it can maintain its societal functions. I didn't know quite. I need to see the Japanese because it's kind of an odd wording in English. But anyway, it is now or never when it comes to policies regarding births and childbirth. It is an issue that simply cannot wait any longer. Well, this is very much after the fact, because this is what Japan's birth rate looks like. Japan has not had population level, population replacement level fertility since 1975. This is a really old problem in Japan. So you see there's been a gradual decline, and then really since 2010 or so, the birth rate has been, hovering between 1.3 and 1.4. And again, as Paul Chang said, Japan's birth rate is nowhere near the lowest in East Asia. Singapore's is lower, Hong Kong's is lower. Korea generally, gets to claim the dubious distinction of having the lowest birth rate. All of East Asia has birth rates that are around or below what demographers call lowest low fertility, which is 1.3 or lower. Now, my first, this is an advertisement. I just wanted to have, a few words about what the book is about. So I really, as you could tell from the title that Christina read, I really focus on norms in this book, and the social norms in Japan that support gender inequality and that continue to more or less support the male breadwinner model of the family that, of course, was the post-war model. And I argue for strengthening norms that support what's called in the demographic literature a dual earner, dual carer model of the family, where both partners in a couple are in the labor market and are also very active at home. I want to make a footnote about the title as well. I did not make the title. In fact, I had to also learn how to read it, how to pronounce it. But what happened was there's a particular professor at Todai who usually gives me really good titles for my books in Japanese, but I didn't rely on him this time. I had a wonderful editor at Chuo Koron Shinsha, actually, who that Todai professor recommended me to. And they decided on the title at an editorial board meeting in August. The book came out in September. And the editor and I had tossed around an email, various possible titles. And then Tanaka-san wrote to me and said, we had our final editorial board meeting this week and discussed your book. And someone came up with this title, what do you think? And I said, yeah, it's great, except the kanji are really complicated. The odd end is not a word that I frequently use, but anyway, they came up with the title, and I think it's I really like this title. Anyway, so first, I raised the question, was it inevitable the Japanese fertility or birth rate was going to drop so low? No, it wasn't, and I'll show you why. So the next graph I'm going to show you is a different way of measuring fertility, which is a much more accurate way than the total fertility rate. I won't go into what a total fertility rate is. But what I'm going to show you is completed cohort fertility. And I want to explain it before I show you the graph, but that means we go back in time and we look at a particular cohort of women, say born in 1955, and then we look at them 45 years later to see how many kids they ended up having. Some people use 50 years later, but the number of women who get pregnant at 47 or 48 is very, very low. So it's pretty safe to use a cutoff point of 45, age 45, for a woman's so-called reproductive lifespan. So if you do that, you see, you're looking at lives, right, across 45 years. And this is a much more accurate way of looking at the fertility rate for reasons I could talk about more. But anyway, so what I did, I looked at completed cohort fertility rates for a bunch of countries, and the 3 countries I discussed the most in the book are US, Sweden, and Japan, and I can address why if you want to know later. But this is change in completed cohort fertility in these 3 countries. So if we go back on the left-hand side to women born in 1950, by the time this is their birth year, by the time they reached 45, in all 3 countries, the birth rate was about two children per woman. And look what happens in Japan. It just falls off after about women born in 1955, which would be what, 1955. So at age 45, that's 2000, is that right? Yeah. And then Sweden just kind of chugs along at average of two children per woman. And here, US birth rate has gone up. It's currently going down. But again, this is kind of the historical view. These are women who've already completed their childbirth. So you can see Japan just kind of falls off the map. And I've done this for as many countries that I can get data for, and that'll probably be in the English language book. But in any case, you can see, this is not a new problem at all, right? And again, the Japanese government has been trying to deal with this issue for quite a long time. And as Christina said, 2 of the policy goals have been to raise the labor force participation rate of married women, especially mothers. And the purpose of that is really to alleviate current labor shortages. And as I'll show you in a moment, this has been pretty successful. And to increase the country's birth rate, because that will help to alleviate future labor shortages. And here, no policies have worked. So again, as Christina alluded to, we seem to be on the same wavelength today. Former Prime Minister Abe's womenomics policy, one of the policies, aimed to create an environment in which women find it comfortable to work. And indeed, the Japanese government has lauded or boasted about the recent increase in Japanese women's labor force participation to a level above the US level. And indeed, that's a huge change in Japan. Oops, sorry. So this, again, compares just these three countries. We could add many others. But you see the white line is the proportion of mothers, so women with children who are employed. And it's gone, the white line has gone above the green line, which is the United States. Again, Sweden just kind of chugs along. And Sweden has had very high female labor force participation for a long time. But Japan's line has gone above the US, and that's been noted in Japan. However, there are still, as we know, many, many signs of continuing gender inequality in the workplace. Women's share of non-regular precarious jobs has increased. And I looked into, kind of what is the composition of the increase in mothers' labor force participation. And when I broke it down by education across countries, actually the proportion of highly educated women in Japan who are employed is relatively low compared to other countries. In fact, Japan is one of only 3 OECD countries, together with South Korea and Turkey, with a gap in highly educated men's and women's labor force participation rates of at least 20%. Let me show you what I mean. This is the figure I want you to look at. So this shows that highly educated Japanese men participate at a much higher rate in employment than highly educated Japanese women, much, much higher rate. Sweden, the two sexes are about the same, 2 percentage points different. US, highly educated men, 10 percentage points more participation in employment than highly educated women. But Japan is an outlier, as it is on many, many indicators of gender inequality, along with South Korea. So what does this mean? Well, one could argue that Japan, in terms of economic growth, is not reaping the economic gains possible from having a young, highly educated female population, which it absolutely has now. And likewise, highly educated women are not reaping the economic gains they could be reaping from being in employment, and especially in full-time. So if we go back to the Japanese government's policy goals, labor force participation of married women, especially mothers, absolutely has increased. Birth rate has not. So what's the problem? Well, I argue that Japan's leaders have left out a third goal that crucially links these two goals, and that is to increase gender equality in the workplace and in the house. And really, my argument is based on 40 years of studying gender inequality in Japan, and also being a social demographer. So if you go to my office, I have probably 200 articles published in journals, mostly by European social demographers, trying to figure out the puzzle of low birth rates, because all of Southern Europe has very low birth rates. Most of Eastern Europe has very low birth rates, and birth rates are coming down, as I said, in the US and many other post-industrial countries. So one of the theories that European social demographers have been very enthusiastic about is that the theory is that post-industrial countries that have really made it possible for women to balance work and family are the ones that have not suffered large declines in their birth rates. And of course, we immediately go to Northern Europe, as examples. And the logic is, as women's labor force participation increases, which it has done throughout the post-industrial world, along with women's education increasing, women on average now get more education than men do in post-industrial countries. So as their labor force participation has increased, there needs to be greater gender equality at home, i.e. in housework and childcare. And this will lessen what Arlie Hochschild, famous sociologist, said many years ago, women's second shift. So it's the idea that women essentially have two jobs. They still have their job at home if the gender division of labor at home has not changed. And now they have a job in the labor market. And there have been dozens and dozens of articles written by European demographers about what is it that helps people if they want to have two or more kids, how do they achieve that? And one of the things that demographers have looked at a lot is whether women are doing all of the household work. And in Japan and South Korea, again, the next slide will show you this, but Japan and South Korea are absolute outliers in terms of the proportion of household work that women do. So I'm not the first one to look at this, but this is a graph showing on the left hand, the vertical axis, the total fertility rate. Again, I use that because it's the type of indicator for the birth rate that we have the most access to. And then on the horizontal axis is the ratio of women's unpaid work versus men's. So what it shows is that on average in Japan, women do over 5 times as much unpaid work as men do. And Korea is usually ahead of Japan. Here it's a little bit better than Japan. But as you can see with the regression line, there, as women do more and more, the higher and higher percentage of unpaid work, the birth rate is lower. Now, obviously, this is at the country level. You know, it's not looking at individuals, but I've circled Japan and Korea, and then this morning I decided, oh, I should put a circle around Southern Europe, because there you go, Spain, Italy, Greece, Portugal. And then in the left-hand upper corner, France, Sweden, US, Denmark, Australia, and so on. So again, mostly economists have looked at this. I don't think I've seen sociologists look at this in the aggregate, but in any case, this is an aggregate relationship. It is statistically significant. So I argue in the book, not surprisingly, that a central problem in Japan is that workplace conditions as well as social policies continue to be based on a male breadwinner or carer model of the family. And happily, with this audience, I don't think I need to talk very much about working conditions in Japan. I'm planning to kind of skip over those slides. But basically what I argue is workplace conditions and social policies are based on the ideology of distinct gender roles for men and women, and they reproduce those norms. So I'm going to talk about how policies reproduce those norms. They don't break them down. I stuck this slide in, and I'm going to go through it quickly, but I can come back to it if you have questions. This is actually not in the Japanese book, but I decided to put it in the American English language book. So I've done a lot of work over the last number of years trying to figure out who holds certain types of gender role attitudes and how we even think about gender role attitudes, because this was based on my feeling that, you know, we usually talk about gender role attitudes as being very liberal, egalitarian, or conservative. And I decided it's much more complicated than that. So I did quantitative analyses. These are the 2 main articles with highly talented quantitative graduate students of mine. And we found, again, I can describe the methodology later if you want to hear it, but we found 4 clusters of gender role attitudes that are present in all the post-industrial societies we looked at. Again, my apologies for going fast, but the first cluster is, you know, what we would all imagine kind of traditional or conservative gender role attitudes, where the man is outside the home working for pay and the woman is inside the home. But there's also this, I called this pro-work conservative, sometimes I call it egalitarian feminism. It's hard to make a good term for it, but this is the ideology that women should work for pay, but they have to prioritize the home. And then there's another gender role attitude class that we found, which is much less prominent in any post-industrial society, but it's really about women sort of being able to choose, if they can economically, how they balance work and family. So some women may decide to stay home and focus entirely on childbearing. And some women may combine work and family, but it's kind of a choice framework. And then, of course, what we also think of is at the other end of the pole from conservative gender role attitudes, liberal egalitarianism. And this is basically the Nordic ideology. So both men and women have the right to participate in the labor market and the right to participate heavily at home. So the only thing I want to point out here and in the next slide is that this pro-work conservative ideology is the dominant one in Japan, right? Not surprising. So in the next graph, I put together, for abbreviation's sake, the percentage of people in the population in each of these countries holding either the traditional gender role attitude ideology or pro-work conservative. And Korea takes the cake. This analysis is about 10 years old. And sometimes when I presented it, there's some older Korean man in the audience who says, no, this is not. So, and I can't claim to know whether it's accurate in 2022 or not. But anyway, Korea far outstrips the other countries in terms of there being almost no representation of liberal egalitarianism or flexible egalitarianism. Japan is also over there on the left. And then I just put a bracket around the countries on the right. And note that all of the countries on the right have much higher fertility rates than the countries on the left. South Korea, Greece, Poland, Czech Republic, Italy, Japan, Hungary, so Slovak Republic, Portugal, Southern Europe, Northern Europe. So exactly how do these types of gender role attitudes, what I call pro-work conservative gender role attitudes, discourage couples from having 2 or more children? Well, as I said, if women are supposed to be earning money for the household, but they're supposed to keep taking care of everything at home, they basically have 2 jobs, especially if they're working full-time in the labor market. And from men, by rendering it ideologically defensible or even advocating that men should be breadwinners, it leads men to focus primarily on paid employment and focus very little on housework and childcare. So in other words, there's no kind of overall cultural ideological incentive for men to change their habits. Now, a big deficit in my Japanese book is that I don't talk, this is very much based on what married couples do. And the biggest factor in Japanese low fertility right now is the rate of singlehood, as everybody knows. Over 40% of men in their late 40s are single, and close to that for women. And if you're single, you're probably not going to have a child in these days, as we know. So again, in my American book, I need to talk about this more. And here, I think it's not the only reason that Japanese young men are not getting married by any means, but many of those guys, I wrote about it in my earlier book, are the lost generation. And they cycled, in and out of precarious employment for 20 years, right? And they don't feel able to fulfill the role of being the breadwinner in the family. Young women don't particularly want to marry these guys. They want to marry mainly university educated guys who've been in regular employment. And young women might not want to have to work after they get married. And if they don't want to work, they may not be able to find somebody to marry who will provide enough income for the household. So, there are problems on both sides, and some of the problems are economic, but they're tied to the fact that young men feel like they have to be a good breadwinner before they get married. And that ties back to the pro-work conservative ideology. Okay, I'm gonna skip over this because we know it. And we all know this. This is really, I always think this is kind of ridiculous. The OECD measures long work hours as being over 50. I think most people in this room work over 50 hours. Academics tend to, graduate students tend to, but that's the way the OECD measures it. And you can see why, because in the majority of European countries, people don't work more than 50 hours. And here again, you see what outliers Japan and Korea are. And the reason, another footnote, the reason only Japan and Korea are in these graphs is that unfortunately for me, Japan and Korea are the only countries in the OECD. And OECD aggregate statistics are great, in terms of looking at the workforce. So, other countries that we're very interested in, Taiwan, Hong Kong, mainland China now, because obviously very low birth rate and so forth, they're not in OECD statistics. So you have to turn to the ILO or other databases, but then you don't have as good coverage of Europe. So I've made this point. No, I haven't yet made this point. Turning to policy, my feeling is that work-family policies in Japan have made a lot of adjustments to accommodate working mothers, but they have not, the policies have not disrupted the fundamental conditions of regular full-time employment for either men or women. And examples of the adjustment to working mothers, and absolutely this has worked. There are many, many, many more women who remain in the labor force, certainly after they get married and after they have a baby, because of the new policies. They've been very effective, but there are problems. So there's this restricted regular employee option that women can change and can choose if they want to. And that means never being subject to, rotation or, transfers to another part of the country. And also jitan, short work hour option. And this is very, very popular among mothers because they're guaranteed legally this, short work hour option and can use that until their child is 3 years old. So women can leave work at 4 or 4:30, go pick up their child from childcare, go to the grocery store on the way home, make dinner and so forth. And they're not bound to, or obligated to stay at the workplace till 6 or 7 or 8 p.m. So women love this. The women we interviewed love this. But there are problems with it, which I'll save, and you can ask me.
We will have questions, so you probably should.
I know,
wrap up soon.
I think I'm very close.
Okay.
There's also many women extend their childcare leave past 1 year, almost always because the couple can't find a childcare space for their child. Government's doing much better job these days of shortening the childcare waiting lists, but so again, these gender-specific policies, I feel, reinforce women's primary responsibility at home, secondary responsibility in the workplace, and they don't do anything to adjust men's working lives or to encourage men to change their work hours. So I argue that policies need to be more gender neutral. Is it going to happen? I don't think so, but that's what I argue. And if done properly, and again, I can talk about this, I think it would improve men's lives as well as women's lives. And then as a, end note or footnote, again, male non-regular workers need extra economic assistance in order to feel like they can get married and have children. I can go through this later, but Swedish work Sweden has a huge advantage because they started working on this 40 years ago. And one interesting thing about Swedish policy, it has almost never been a pro-natalist policy. It's been a gender equality set of policies. So I have policy recommendations in the book, and I think I can leave it there.
Why don't you leave up the policy recommendation
Oh, yeah.
slide, that way
Yeah.
while we're listening to questions.
Right, that's a good idea.
Thank you. I'm sorry to have rushed you.
No,
but
I think-
know we've got an
I
audience full of
spoke too
questions.
long.
No,
I
this
did,
is
yeah.
fantastic. Learned so much.
This was after taking out a lot of slides.
Now I'm motivated to read the book in Japanese or with the questions.
I love this translator because he just puts things into very readable. Yomiyasu.
I'll try. We have a lead-off question by Sam Sekiguchi, who's one of our associates this year and is working as a consultant with Dentsu and doing research on corporate public relations, social issues in Japan and the US. So he is perfect to ask our leader question.
You were nodding as I was talking, so.
It's okay, yeah, it's very interesting topic for me because I'm gonna get married with my partner. And then I'm thinking to have a child, so this is very interesting topic for me. So thank you, Professor. I have a comment and
Can you
question.
tell me again where you were?
Sorry.
Where do you work?
Like PR, I'm Dentsu, PR consulting Dentsu. It's one of the advertising
Right,
company
right.
in Japan.
I don't know specifically what their policy. is.
Okay, it's all right, yeah.
It had a bit of a scandal over.
So Christina said, like, my group company has been criticized for long working hours
I
for
know.
many years.
I
So
know.
I think Christina, like, experience working in my company, maybe I can provide some insights.
Yeah.
But like, yeah, I have one question and one comment. And my question is about the slowness of a government response. Like you said, like this program is very old, since 1971. So it seems like for the government, there is a lack of understanding and urgency on
Yes.
this matter. And even
A
for
lot or a lack of.
lack of, exactly,
Right.
lack of. So rather than that, like public is more concerned about this issue.
Yeah, I think so.
So why has the Japanese government put off these actions on this matter? This is my first question.
Why haven't they? Yeah,
Yeah, what is the fundamental cause of taking so much time to start working on this issue?
well, I'm going to say a few kind of rude things first.
Mhm.
Japan is a country run by old men.
Yeah, exactly, yeah.
It's a gerontocracy.
Mhm.
And, that's being written about in the media, but, and Japanese companies, because of the seniority system, right? A lot of managers who men deal with, right? They're in the hierarchy, corporate hierarchy, they've never changed a diaper. They weren't around when their wife had children. They haven't, so they don't, I think the seniority system, and this is a huge topic, but it's a problem, right? Because if you have a manager who's 50 years old and a young guy, 25, 26, 27, whatever, gets married and wants to take childcare leave, manager has to say, okay, even though it is a legal right, but the legal right doesn't matter to most men, right? What matters, and I could talk about that, this is a big part of my section of my book, but the social pressures within the work team and the workplace are so enormous that it would take a pioneer, I call them norm pioneers in the book, to break those norms is just too much to expect, right? So anyway, the government, I think a lot of people in the government, frankly, don't understand the problem. They can't create policies because they don't understand the fundamental problems. And in companies, the age hierarchy generally is a problem. So in the US, we have less of a seniority principle, and it's much more possible that, say, you or another guy getting married and thinking about having a kid it's much more possible that your manager would be 40 years old and have had the experience. So this absolutely comes out in interviews we did, which I didn't have time to talk about. But so I think the government basically, I'll tell you. I'm sorry, I could just talk and talk.
The government is not made of security experts or industrial policy experts, yet they managed to make a good security, well, whether it's a good security policy, it's not. You know, we don't necessarily think the politicians have to understand from their hearts to make good policy.
Let me tell you,
The sociologists in Japan have some blame for not bringing this forward.
sociologists in Japan are not really studying this in Japan.
So it's also an academic question.
Well, that's a problem. It is. Definitely. Economists, I hang out with labor economists. Because they're much more into these issues, and that's what I've done throughout my career. Although some of my friends are sociologists, but most of my academic friends in Japan are labor economists. But I'll tell you a very quick story of when I was in Japan in October. I was able to go because my editor, signed on the dotted line and said, if she gets COVID, we'll take care of her, and we'll make sure she gets a plane ticket to go back to the US and so forth, because it was before all the entry restrictions were lifted. And I've become acquainted with a really high-powered macroeconomist in the MHLW. And I told her I was in Japan, and she was like, yes, let's get together. So I went in and I gave her a copy of my book, and we were talking away. And she was talking, it was very funny because she's a macro economist. She's mostly been focused on finance issues, but recently she's been assigned, looking at gender inequality. So she said, talking away Japanese, and she said, gender inequality is a big problem in this country. And I said, Naruhodo, it is. And then she was showing me all these data, graphs and so forth that she constructed. And I said, study, this is in my book. Look at these pages in my book. And we got so excited. And then she arranged for me to talk to Mori Masako. And maybe I won't talk about how that went. But basically, I could hardly get a word in edgewise in that meeting. But my friend in MHLW, my acquaintance, said, when we were having this, frenetic conversation about how much we agreed and so forth, I said, but there are data. She said, politicians don't care. That's what she said.
Let's go, Christine. I want to take 2 questions from the room, and then I also have a question online. So hold your answer. We get 2 questions.
Yeah. So my name is.
Introduce yourself.
Sorry, my name is Estelle. I am a Dutch full-time working mom in Japan. Normally, I'm just here for 1 year, and I work for Deutsche Bank. And before that, I worked for JP Morgan Stanley, all in Japan. Now, I wonder if, like what you said, like about the policies, etc. I wonder whether policies are enough, like to accommodate mothers, because I think it's rather the attitude rather than the of your environment. Because all the 3 firms I worked for, they had policies for flexible working, etc. I'm not aware of a single woman who has taken up on that, and certainly no man has ever taken, because and also maybe just to share a story. Also, sorry.
We do need
So I wonder, just like I guess you already answered it. Yeah, is it enough? Is it to have policies, or do we need to change attitudes?
Okay.
And how?
Policies are not.
And Susan Bard.
I guess my question is, we know that turning around fertility problems is incredibly difficult.
Yes.
So we're talking still about a very general problem. And you said
Absolutely.
at the beginning. So could you zero in on a country that has successfully improved its fertility rate?
Yeah.
Has there been a study linking any particular policy with that uptick?
So I think the best country to illustrate that is Germany. Because and I haven't studied the policy reforms closely, but certainly there's enough in English that I can read about those policies. Germany's birth rate was quite low as well. And German policies about leave, childcare, changed, I think, in maybe about 12 years ago. And there has been a slight uptick in the birth rate.
And as you think about the policies, the first question was, what about the attitudes? And we also have an online question from Ingrid Cooper about attitudes towards marriage. And some of the European societies that have had higher fertility are also having out of wedlock children. So
Yeah.
if you think about both the question here as well as the question from online about attitudes. to
And I
marriage.
think there's another question. Can I take another question?
Yes.
I'm Takshimas from Sociology University. Thank you for your presentation. My question is about language and ideology. So I found the word black no shachiku.
Right.
Meaning a book.
Right.
So this means that this is against the negative, the negative attitude from our world. But still, as you show in the chart, the Japanese still walking too long on words very big. So sometimes words can change their attitude, but sometimes you cannot. So what do you think about the word, buzzword, some questionable word, and the ideology?
Well, where does the like shachiku, where did it come from? You know, who originated the word?
I don't know, but one of my research topic is about how language create a market.
Oh.
So I teach
wow.
marketing people. So
that's
sometimes
interesting.
also someone or one person create some market with one person karaoke or one person
Yeah.
barbecue.
Yeah,
So language can change their attitude.
that's a
or-
really, really good.
Yeah.
That's a really good point.
And Kishida-san is now saying that please giving.
Yeah.
This is his new word.
Yeah,
So he wants to change
yeah,
the people's mind or attitude or
Yeah.
ideology, but sometimes but
right, not always, yeah, exactly. I mean, catchwords, I think they're called catchwords because people catch on, you know, and I think this is a really good term. But that's very interesting. I originally studied linguistics, so I would like to talk about this. Policies are not enough, no. They're not enough at all. What else was I supposed to answer? Oh,
Yeah, just whether, yeah, but I think you already said, like, how do you change attitude, I guess, like rather.
well,
than
it's
policy.
very hard. It's very hard. And, you know, there's a difference between attitudes and norms, right? So, and I could go into it more about the gender role attitude classes and how they're composed. Some of the statements that people agree with that put them in one of those 4 ideological classes, so to speak. Some of the statements are norms, like a mother should, and some of them are just gender role attitudes. But the difference for sociologists, the difference between an attitude and a norm is an attitude is something you can hold yourself. You may share the attitude with other people or not. A norm is about what's socially appropriate, right? A norm is how you should behave. And as we all know, I mean, Japan is a society of very strong norms. And mawari no hito, you know, what the people around you are doing, what your nakama is doing is extraordinarily important. And so my approach is, I'm not a behavioral economist, but I think behavioral economists have a lot to teach us about how to change norms. No social scientists really change norms. It's a puzzle. It's a puzzle. But a lot more economists work on it than sociologists. But well, let me show you one thing from my other slides, because is that okay? It's about paternity leave.
Okay,
Yes. Daijoubu?
and then anyone else who has a question? I have 2 more questions, so.
Okay. So my policy recommendations, it's the last chapter of the book, but these are some of the specific policy recommendations. Oh,
Sure.
there's some. Stop share. Yes. Awesome. Oh, I see. And then resume share. Yeah, so I wanted to argue that the government, not that I think it's going to happen, but that the government should make it mandatory for new fathers to take 6 weeks of childcare leave at full pay. Then there's no economic reason for men not to take leave. And you know, that is a problem. Men generally make more money than women, and it's more costly to the family if the father takes leave, right? And that's a reason many people give for not taking leave. One of my consultants in the Ministry of Health, Labor and Welfare said, no, don't say that, Mary, because it'll just be ignored. So Chinami-san. So she encouraged me to, oh, goodness gracious, what's happening? I can't take over. There. So she encouraged me to reformulate this. And so this is what ended up in my book. For men who take childcare leave, they should get 100% of the salary they were making before leave, and they should be able to take it leave for up to 8 weeks. And Chinami-san's rationale was maternity leave, you know, has been well established in Japan since after World War II. And mothers are guaranteed, it's guaranteed 100% of their salary.
One thing I would add to that is not just that it's guaranteed option, but that the default is that it's taken. So you have to
Yes.
actively say, I don't want it,
Right.
decline it.
And as
With reason for declining.
yeah, as
Like jury
Christina
duty or something.
says, yeah, well, many years ago, economists determined that if the professors sort of by default, when we're hired at the university, we're placed in a retirement program, it's much better for us because most of us don't understand money anyway. And if we're placed in a retirement program, then we have, in other words, some of our earnings will be put into, because we don't get pensions, will be put into retirement. Then if we don't want that, we have to actively opt out of it.
And
And
having the default as the option. that's preferable.
absolutely.
Listening to our questions, Trevor, and short question.
Yes, thank you so much for this great presentation. Kind of piggybacks off this, and I agree with the policy recommendations. I'd also describe myself as a political economist and institutionalist, so I kind of
Yeah.
believe in these institutional
Right,
powers to change form and attitude.
right,
Where I'm going with this is thinking of things like number of labor hours where you're
Right.
working a week, maximum labor hours,
right.
and the countries that you cited, like Sweden,
That's
Nordic
right.
countries, Netherlands. And
That's right.
oftentimes the way that those like labor hours are taking leave, the way that they're enforced in these countries is because of strong labor
That's
organizations.
right, collective bargaining.
Collective bargaining, which is something that is not as strong.
No.
Right, and so I guess my question is about enforcement, which
Right.
is beyond things like giving these policies, how do you force companies to not
Well,
tell their employees?
that's a really good question, and we've seen that with Kataraki Kaikaku. You know, there's been some progress made, but here I think I would say, you know, that the interests of the government are to raise the fertility, right? Do owners of companies think about that? I'm not so sure. Owners of companies want their workers to be as productive as possible. And lots of reasons, you know, traditionally that's been translated as stay in the workplace for 10 hours. So, which is not accurate thinking, but be that as it may. So I think the interests of the government and the interests of companies, obviously they don't always dovetail and collect. Japan is a country where, in my mind, especially on a comparative framework, employees don't have very much power. And another big problem in Japan is that interfirm mobility has only increased slightly. Because in the US, we don't have any policies, right? We don't have any policies to help families. But if you're a highly talented worker, you're working for McKinsey has pretty good policies, but you know, if you're working for a company and you have to negotiate with your manager whether you will get paid leave or not. But more and more, I think in the US, men as well as women want to negotiate for that, and if they can't, they can find another good job. You can't do that. I mean, it's much more difficult. So I think employers, to my mind, have a lot of control over employees, right? I mean, you can't, somebody told me many, many years ago, a friend I had who worked for Daiichi Kankyo, he said, you know, Mary, this is what this was in Nicholas' book. You know what permanent employment, lifetime employment is like? It's like you're sitting in a bathtub with lukewarm water. It's not so great, but it's really cold if you get out. So a lot of people in the government are really very concerned about the lack of, an external need.
And then is the online question from Andrew Oros was asking you to connect the demographic decline with the labor challenge and the economic problem.
Yeah.
And I'm sure Moreno was on his last question, and we're just going a little over time.
Thank you. My name is Moriana. I'm a professor of the Institute. As for your conclusion, I think there's some obstacle to enforce this one. First one, the government money is important for the child care system. The second one, there's a difference between the vested interest. There are many women who don't want to get the tax beneficial. Therefore,
Fewer and fewer.
So Ministry of Finance try to equalize the system, but there are many against this system for the equalization of the system. The third point, conclusion third point, the small and medium companies, they don't enough money to pay for the labor.
They don't.
So your conclusion, I totally agree with how they implement this
I agree.
conclusion. That's my question.
They're kind of idealistic recommendations. And one of the criticisms, Higuchi Yoshio, who's JIRPT, he's an old friend of mine, and I had lunch with him when I was in Japan in October, and he said, well, he brought my book to lunch, and he read about half of it, and he said, we're really dealing with people in large companies, and he's absolutely. Yeah, the Chusho Kikyo issues are really tough and really simple issues. I agree with you. And what was your first point?
Turkey is cost a lot, but the government money.
I know it does. I know it does, but you know what? My Japanese interviewees all trust public child education, which is a wonderful thing. There's trust, of citizens. We don't even have public child care in the United States. In Sweden too, people trust child care.
The question is, there is lots of public money.
I know.
And most of the people are against to raise the tax revenue for the cost of the child care.
I know. Well, I've been interested that Kishida has not given any specifics. This new agency is going to do. I hope it's not Kodomo Teate, because I have a lot of evidence that Kodomo Teate didn't work. We know it didn't. You're not going to encourage people to have a second child if you give them $300 or $800 a month. People told me you could buy a new refrigerator.
Well, I hope that your book helps to guide the government towards effective policies and get a wider readership, because your goal is that the attitudes change. And
My
so
goal was a wide readership.
it really is important that you're able to contribute the academic ideas and also to reach a broader audience. And thank you so much for sharing with us here today. It's really been fascinating.